Welcome, everybody, to the Silicon Flatirons Conference on Artificial Intelligence, AI, and its impact on jobs and the labor force. I'm Howard Surden, a professor at the University of Colorado Law School, and also the director of the AI initiative of Silicon Flatirons Center for Law and Technology here at the law school. So today's topic looks at a timely and important subject. How is artificial intelligence likely to impact jobs and labor force in the near term? The topic of artificial intelligence has been subject to much misunderstanding by the public and also exaggeration. There's a lot of fear and concern about the topic of AI, and in particular, its role in the automation of jobs. So our goal is to examine this topic in a rigorous, evidence-based way. So to this end, our first panel will be focused on understanding artificial intelligence, what it is, but just as importantly, what it is not. AI is capable of many amazing things, but it also has many significant limitations in many areas compared to human performance. Thus, it is as crucial to comprehend the kind of things that AI technology is good at, and also why it is good at, understanding principles for what kinds of tasks AI's current technology is good at, and just as important, what AI is not good at. Understanding those capabilities and the limitations will then allow us to better understand the kinds of jobs and also the work tasks that AI is likely to automate in the next 5 to 10-year time frame, and also the kind of tasks and jobs that AI is not likely to be able to automate or replace in the 5 to 10-year time frame. So that's our first panel. And once we have a firm understanding of artificial intelligence, what it is, the kind of tasks it can be used to automate, the kind of tasks that it's not so good at today, we then turn to our second panel. This panel will be focused upon the possible government policy responses from the private sector, the public sector, the nonprofit sector of potential job loss or task loss through AI automation. So one aspect what we will be looking at in this panel is to try and understand if job losses through artificial intelligence is any different or worse than other similar impacts in the past on the job force that we've seen. So some of these have been past technological changes, such as mechanization of factories or agriculture, or another major influence on job loss has been globalization, manufacturing being outsourced to other lower wage countries. Importantly, we also hope to think about the idea of not just job losses, but also completely new types of jobs or job categories that might be created by AI that never existed before, in the same way that computers have brought new jobs, such as data analyst or computer game programmer, that never existed before. We'll also hopefully talk about the role of education and the disparate impact of AI on different aspects of the economy. So one important aspect I want to talk about is our goal is to refrain from speculation about the future of AI technology. In other words, what might AI, what new technologies might or might not develop in the future? That is not our goal today to talk about that. Rather, our analysis will be rooted firmly in evidence of what AI can currently do, and thinking and projecting forward no more than 5 years, maybe 10 years, based upon current technological developments. Now, this is important because a lot of people who talk about or explore this issue in the media often engage in speculation about the future of AI, about technological developments that may or may not occur. I don't think this is a useful or even a valid way of analyzing the situation. We don't know what's going to happen in the future. We don't know what technological developments may or may not occur. And at any rate, the future technology is likely to look very different than what we imagine today. So what I want to encourage you is, when you hear speculation in the media, to be skeptical about the future of AI. Press people, where's the evidence, question their assumptions. So to that end, all of our analysis today will be based upon evidence of AI, its current technological developments, and we will refrain from undue speculation beyond the 5-year time frame, which is the only thing I think we can reasonably do with confidence. So we have a panel of terrific experts from all areas of society represented: academia, government, nonprofits, private sector, and I'm really grateful that they're able to join us virtually. Finally, I want to thank the terrific folks at Silicon Flatirons who've worked so hard to make this conference happen. Thank you to Amy Stepanovich, Heather Martin, Vanessa Koppel, Sarah Schnittgun, Nate Mariotti, Catherine Coble, and our terrific student who worked so hard, Wilson Scarberry, and many of the other folks at University of Colorado Law School who worked so hard to make this happen. Our tech support, Teresa Coverley and John Sabre. I'm so happy also that you, the audience, are able to join us virtually for this conference in these unsettling times. I trust that this will be an interesting and informative conference. So without further ado, let's turn to our first panel on artificial intelligence and its capabilities and limitations, which I will be moderating. We have a terrific set of experts, and I will only give them a brief introduction in the interest of time, but more extensive biographical information are available through links on the conference website. So let me briefly introduce our panel one conference panelists, just in alphabetical order. First, we have Nisar Ahmed, who's assistant professor in the College of Engineering here at University of Colorado Boulder. Next, we have Melanie Mitchell, who's a Davis professor at the Santa Fe Institute and also a professor of computer science at Portland State University. Next, joining us is Claire Monteleoni, assistant professor, associate professor at the Department of Computer Science here at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And last but not least, Dr. Roland Vogl, who's the executive director of CodeX, Stanford Center for Legal Informatics, and also the executive director of the Stanford Program in Law, Technology, and Science. So please, I'm very pleased that we have such a distinguished panel here to explore this really interesting topic. So let me start off by just throwing out a first question to Claire, and then we'll have all of the rest of the panelists will have a chance to weigh in. So just to set the table for our audience, when people talk about artificial intelligence or AI, what do they mean? And how does AI differ from other types of computing or automation generally?
Sure. So AI, artificial intelligence, is a technology field. It has to do with the design of algorithms, so methods to automatically analyze data, as well as architectures. And it also has somewhat to do with agents interacting in the world, such as in robotics. So if we look at the history of, say, web search that developed in various search engines, that really evolved in sort of at the same time and complementary with the evolution of machine learning. Machine learning is currently, I would say, at the heart of artificial intelligence, but the typical breakdown of artificial intelligence is into several fields. So machine learning, which is methods that can find patterns in data and also adapt over time. Natural language processing, which we might think of as text mining. Computer vision, which is finding patterns and objects automatically in pictures and video. And robotics. But you'll see if you look at sort of cutting edge research on natural language processing, vision, or robotics, now all of those techniques actually have to have machine learning in them to be cutting edge. So if you're looking at a technology and wondering if it's AI, typically the attribute you're looking for is, does the method learn automatically and adapt? That would be for an agent, such as a robotics method. Or if it's about data analytics, is the data analytics happening in an automated way? So Harry, I think you're muted. are you asking me something?
Thank you. Sorry about that. Zoom issue. So what I heard you say is one of the aspects that, in your opinion, that distinguishes AI from other types of automation is the presence of machine learning, or the ability to learn patterns from data to engage in autonomous activity to some degree. Let me throw this out to the rest of the panel. In your opinion, what distinguishes AI? What is AI in your opinion, and what distinguishes it from other types of computing or automated activities?
So,
and I suppose I'll have the panelists raise their hands on using the Zoom app, and I will call on you. It's probably the most orderly way to do this. Okay, Melanie.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, because even in the field itself, people don't agree on what AI is, which is, I don't know if that's typical of many academic fields, but there's a lot of discussion about exactly what is AI and what isn't AI. In the beginning of the field, 1950s, machine learning was an extremely small part of the field, and remained that way until probably the 80s, late 80s. And so now, as Claire said, machine learning's kind of taken over the field. But I don't think everyone in the field would say that we have to have a learning system to be AI. I think there's some AI systems we use today that have very little learning in them. One article that I really liked trying to define AI referred to it as an anarchy of methods, meaning that unlike in, say, mathematics or some other fields, where a lot of methods kind of come together in a unified theory, AI is really a whole bunch of different separate methods that people kind of pick and play, match up together in different ways. And so when I teach AI, the students are kind of frustrated, because it's like, well, it's just all these methods. Isn't there some unifying theory there? And I think that that's one thing that AI really lacks, because we don't really understand ourselves what we mean when we say intelligence.
Great. Yeah, so it sounds like even in the field, there's disagreement. One description I've seen that I found useful, which of course doesn't cover the meaning of AI, but that is using technology to automate tasks that when humans do it, typically are thought to require intelligence. I think that covers some aspect of it, although not completely. Do any of the other panelists want to weigh in on this question here?
No, Harry, I think I would concur with your very broad description, and it's true that in recent years the statistical AI approach has generated the most excitement, certainly in the media, and I think that's where most of the funding is in academia also. But at least for applications in the legal space, the rules-driven approaches are still can still help us automate and mechanize a lot of tasks that traditionally only human lawyers could do. And so yeah, but I think yeah, all these definitions I think make a lot of sense.
Okay, great. Yeah, so what I'm hearing is there's a constellation of tasks, techniques that surround AI. We have machine learning, rules-based and knowledge representation put together to help automate tasks that when humans perform it, typically are thought to require intelligence, such as playing chess or driving cars. Nisar, did you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, all of that, what everyone said is, concurs with what we think of in the area I work in robotics. So Claire and Melanie and Roland just mentioned some examples of, human level tasks that, were thought to require intelligence that are now no longer considered intelligent. They're just considered routine automation. And so a lot of things, even in computer vision nowadays, object tracking or perception are just considered routine. But, back 20 years ago, they would have been unthinkable for someone to get to the level of performance that they have now. So So some of it is contextual and some of it is almost generational in definition. And the field I work in aerospace, autopilots were considered intelligent. They used to, their pilots were afraid that they would be out of a job when planes could fly themselves, but we still have pilots in planes and they're not fully intelligent. So there's still some things that fall through the cracks that you still need humans, even when these systems are designed to do something, they don't always do them as well as they were designed to do in the first place.
Great. So I hear two really important points in there. One of the more important points is that what I've heard from most of the panelists is that when we use AI to automate a task that human does, that humans are thought to require intelligence, we do it very differently than the way the human solves the problem. So the way the technology solves the problem is thought to be very different from the way the human solves the problem. So I think that's an important point for the audience to note that, when we're doing an automated translation using AI, it involves, various statistical associations, which might be very different than the way a human does translation, which engages with the meaning and underlying semantics and knowledge about the real world. So that's an important point. And the other point I want to draw out that you made is that a lot of AI systems still require humans in the loop. So hopefully meaning that they're not fully autonomous or automated, but sometimes will perform partial automation and then require a human to make some take some action. With that in mind, let me toss the second question to Nisar. So looking at the current state of artificial intelligence, what types of problems or tasks is artificial intelligence good at today? And can you give us some principles to understand the type of tasks that AI is good at and why?
Sure. And if it's okay, I'm going to share my screen for a little show and tell because, it's always more fun to show videos and things. Is that okay?
Please do.
Thanks. Let's see if I can get this. Okay, so everyone can see this, hopefully. So we'll just jump into the presentation. This goes. So just to repeat the question, what is the current state of the art for AI and what kinds of problems it's currently good at today and why? So building on what Claire said before, that machine learning is sort of this 800-pound gorilla in the room, and it's not everything to AI. There's far more to it, and even in the stuff I work in, there's planning, there's logic, there's inference, there's symbolic reasoning, there's all these subfields of AI that are not going to be fully represented here, but I'll explain why it is that machine learning, for example, is considered, sort of the thing that everyone is obsessing over. And just to kind of get to Harry's point, what are the principles? So these are just some examples, and quick in blue, what I have is my, oversimplification of what is going on in machine learning. As Claire said, it's about finding patterns in data and looking for patterns that change over time. And the learning part is not really like how you and I learn, how humans learn. It is really using data to find an algorithm that turns some list of numbers, which is really what a computer understands, just some input data, into another desired list of numbers. Okay, so this is almost like digital alchemy in some ways. Programmers sometimes can be too lazy to find what that algorithm is. So let the computer figure out what that algorithm is. So, this is the reason why this is becoming popular, in my opinion, that you can kind of represent anything with these types of numbers. So for example, those are just some use cases, and I think Roland will go into more detail with some of these. For example, for the law, legal applications, you could have lots of documents that would take hundreds of lawyers, thousands of hours to sort through to find discovery claims, and then out comes a discovery claim from a machine learning algorithm when you train it on what to look for. You could also have medical diagnoses. So this was a group called DeepMind, which is now part of Google. They were acquired. They have a group that works on healthcare applications. And so this application in particular is looking at 3D retinal scans and looking for patterns to detect diseases. And so they can not only do it as accurately as doctor, but they can also possibly find diseases that would be very difficult for a human doctor to find. And they can sort of correlate and rank order and find the probabilities for these different conditions existing in data. And so what we have here are sort of these data-driven applications. These are, this is like text data, this is sort of 3D medical image data, and looking for patterns that might be, that humans could find, but it might take them a very long time to do just because of the sheer volume of data. So that's something that AI can be very good at. Even if you're not using, say, machine learning, as was mentioned before, you could use rule-based types of things. Over here in robotics, more in my domain, we have this arm, this robot hand for juggling two balls. It's learning how to do it with something called deep learning. This is deep reinforcement learning, where it tries over and over and over again to figure out how to get the kind of motion pattern that it was programmed to find using color images and translating that into high dimensional joint movements on this actuator robot. And then over here, this is actually from 10 years ago, but this is at the advent of autonomous driving. And this is Stanford's autonomous car from the DARPA Urban Challenge, which is learning how to do a reverse power slide parking maneuver between these two cones. So it's trying to basically do a J-turn in between these two traffic cones and park the car. And this is it learning over and over and over again how to do it with demonstrations and repeated trials. So eventually it manages to figure out how to park it with about a meter error on average accuracy between these two traffic cones. Okay, so this is like superhuman sort of maneuvering capability that machine learning can do. And these are things that humans might try to learn, but either it's impossible physically for them to do, or they can do it with just a lot of effort. But with enough data, you can find some algorithm that takes this X, this is what I'm starting with, this is what I know, turn it into something that I want to see. Just to move forward, how does this actually happen? Very often, going back to the human in the loop problem, not just pilots in airplanes and people in cars and things like that, factory workers on the floor, but also programmers behind the curtain are a big part of making these algorithms work. So the algorithm that you find is usually the best fit to some optimization problem. So you have some Y that you want to predict, you have the data that tells you what it should be, or some model that tells you what it ought to be, or whatever, and you have to turn the crank to find out what algorithm gives you that best match. And why is it so popular these days? Why is machine learning sort of dominating? I think my opinion, and maybe this is different for different people, but I think a lot of it has to do with just the proliferation of computing. Storage, CPUs, GPUs are now everywhere, and they're super cheap. And the software for writing these algorithms and implementing them has become very widely available and relatively easier to use than it was in the past, before it was limited to just specialists and people in research groups and places that were really thinking hard about this problem. And now teenagers can do this at school. People can write their own machine learning algorithms. They can set up their own apps and things like that. And also, I think there's a lot of publicity on things like deep fakes and synthetic faces. This image on the bottom left, these are actually fake human faces that were generated using deep learning. So they look very realistic. 20 years ago, this kind of imagery generation would have been impossible, but now we're at the point where machine learning can train itself on just a couple of example images to produce basically photorealistic images. It can also train itself to play video games, and that's arguably what AI is really good at these days, is video games. Beyond that, who knows what it's good for. This is AlphaGo playing against the human world champion. And this is StarCraft, this is AlphaStar. So, playing video games is something computer scientists have figured out. Translating this to practical algorithms is a whole other problem, as I'm sure the other panelists will say. But I just wanted to point out, one thing that AI is, sort of guaranteed to work in is closed worlds, fixed rules, things with high fidelity simulations. You can do quite a lot with that, but the real world is more complicated. Rules can change. There's uncertainty in things. Simulations don't always capture reality. So that's kind of where a lot of the boundaries getting pushed these days. So with that, I'll stop sharing and cede the mic.
Okay, great. So what I heard from you is some of the principles for where AI is good at are areas where there's a lot of data that can be analyzed, and in particular, these closed world areas where all the rules are known and you get instant feedback, or you can get feedback on whether your activities are good and bad, and the system can improve its own behavior based upon that feedback, which looks a little bit like little different from the real world, where you don't often get feedback immediately on your performance, or you don't really know the rules of the game. They're not a fixed set of rules because it's a complicated scenario. Great. And one other point I want to draw out, because it seems like there might be a little bit of confusion. We keep throwing out this idea of the distinction between rules and knowledge representation as one set of AI techniques and machine learning on the other. I thought I'd just clarify with a little example. A rules-based, imagine you're trying to filter out spam email. A rules-based approach involves looking at something out there in the world and then handcrafting a rule using, a programming or logic language that the computer can follow. So maybe you have observed that spam emails often contain the word free. You might create an if-then statement. If an email that comes in has the word free, then it's probably spam. So you've created the rule. One other way of looking, by contrasting against machine learning, it's sort of bottom up, where machine learning looks at the data examples of spam and figures out the likely indicators of spam on its own statistically. So it's the difference between sort of handcrafting knowledge about the world and a human putting that in versus letting the machine figure it out on its own using various algorithms and looking for patterns. So let me throw that question I gave to Nisar out there to the rest of the panel. What kind of tasks is artificial intelligence good at today, and why? Does anyone else want to weigh in on that? You can raise your hand. Claire.
Thanks, Nisar. That was awesome. So things that humans sort of are using emotional intelligence for example, trust, figuring out what sources to trust, are particularly thorny and difficult. That's why we have tons of AI and machine learning researchers getting plucked up by, Facebook and Amazon trying to detect fake news. It's a hard problem. So I would say soft skills are the ones that we currently have trouble, and for some of those aesthetic or emotional soft skills, humans then are very valuable in the loop of these human in the loop and human AI teaming type systems, because that's a frontier that we're very behind on in AI.
Great, and that is focused on the limitations. Claire, can you weigh in on areas where you see AI working very well today in your area, and maybe understanding? I think Nisar did a great job of explaining it. Do you have any other different examples of that?
Yeah, no, that was great. Of course, I'm a machine learner, so I'm more on the analytic side and less on the robotic side. But I'm of course really excited about climate informatics, which is using AI to unlock insights and shed light on climate change. That's actually why I ended up at Boulder. And recently have been getting more interested in how AI can help in the fight against COVID. And, for mobility tracking, analyzing the data that's going to come out of these contact tracing apps. For modeling, my research area is how to learn in light of non-stationarity. So how to learn when your target actually can change over time, and there's sort of no assumptions. It's like playing a game where the rules are always changing. So there's promise for that, for example, in financial markets, in studying climate change, studying pandemics. I'm pretty optimistic about the power of AI.
Great. So one area that I'm hearing that you're talking about that machine learning tends to be good at is certain types of prediction about the future for certain problems where there's appropriate data that can be extrapolated out, and maybe in the climate area. Melanie, did you want to weigh in on areas where AI is particularly good at today, in your view?
I think Nisar did a great job of that. And I agree with Claire that there's a, in the realm of science and sort of scientific analytics, like climate change, COVID, other kinds of even in physics, astronomy, chemistry, and so on, there's been a lot of really great work on using sort of statistical-based AI systems to make sense of data that humans would have a trouble making sense of. And so I think it's going to be a great, important tool going forward in scientific, data analysis.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Nisar, for that great presentation. And Melanie has a terrific book out there, which I encourage you basic natural language understanding, where we've seen great improvements in areas like Siri and Echo, where they can, they don't necessarily understand the content of what you're saying, but they're able to give you pretty good responses compared to the past, at least. So we've made some progress in that area, and we also have seen, pretty good but not amazing machine translations from Google. Again, with limitations, which I think Melanie will talk about shortly. Roland, did you have any commentary where you're seeing AI being successful?
Sure. So I think in legal settings, AI is very good at representing human knowledge in well-defined spaces. So think about how TurboTax works as a sort of rules-based AI system that has a representation of the tax code in it and can apply it to the specific user and come out with a very specific answer. Think about how computable contracts work in automating and mechanizing a contract, the obligations of the contract. It's very good at, the statistical AI, again, the machine learning, bottoms-up approaches, or data-driven approaches are very good at finding the needle in the haystack in litigation, finding risks in large sets of contracts. AI is very good for due diligence, that kind of stuff. It's not good at explaining how it comes to its conclusions and decisions, specifically the data-driven AI, and that's one of the kind of the forefronts of research in legal AI. How does an algorithm decide whether somebody should be left out on bail or not? Things like that. So that's, I think that's where a lot of work is necessary, particularly when AI is used more and more to make really important decisions that have an impact on a person's freedom and things like that.
Great. Well, thank you, Roland. And I think it is important to emphasize the success of the rules and knowledge-based approach. We see this a lot in law, in particular. We're at a law school, we'll talk about that, where hand encoding of knowledge about the legal system and rule has gone a long way in providing what they call expert systems, where we attempt to encode the knowledge of experts in various rules that computers can reason about and give you useful real-world results. And we've seen a lot of success. I know that at Stanford, at CodeX, there's a lot of work on computational law and computable contracts in that realm, and that is different than machine learning, to emphasize that. Great. All right. So let's switch gears here. We've talked about what AI is good at. I think this is just as important to understand what AI is not so good at. What are the limitations? There's a lot of limitations on AI in certain areas compared to human intelligence. And I think it's really important to understand those. Claire talked a little bit about that. Let me throw this out to Melanie. Again, I'll plug your book here because I love it so much. A guy, I don't get a kickback from this, and Melanie didn't ask me to say this. It's just
you should ask for it.
Yes, it's authentic praise for the book, because I think she does a great job of explaining in very straightforward terms the limitations. So I'll throw it out to Melanie to address that.
So we're talking about the limitations of AI systems. So again, AI is this very broad thing. It's hard to say the limitations of AI because it's so many different methods and each one has its own limitations. But I'll talk mostly about sort of machine learning, since that's the primary method that people are using today for all of these applications we're talking about. So I think I'll talk kind of about 3 different areas of limitations. One is in sort of general common sense knowledge. Another one is in abstraction, and the third is in explainability. So in terms of general common sense knowledge, we know that, we humans have a huge amount of knowledge about the way the world works. Like, for instance, I'm looking at Harry right now, and I can tell that, this is a live broadcast, that he hasn't videotaped himself like 5 hours ago, and it's just sort of predicting what I'm going to say. I just know that I know certain things that the way that people operate and so on, and all of these things are either things that we learned either very early in childhood or even innate. And the fact that AI systems, machine learning systems don't have this kind of knowledge can really restrict their abilities in making sense of the situations that they encounter. So one example is in self-driving cars. The most common accident that happens with self-driving cars, the experimental ones that are going around on the roads, and even the Tesla autopilot ones, is that people rear end them because they stop unexpectedly. And the reason they stop unexpectedly is because they don't know what constitutes an obstacle. They're very, very conservative about what's an obstacle. So sometimes they'll stop for things that no human would ever consider to be an obstacle. And the humans behind them won't be expecting that they stop, so they'll rear end them. And that's kind of a common sense issue. And it's very hard to train systems to learn about all of the common sense knowledge that we have in the world. There's just too much of it. And there's this notion in AI of the long tail of knowledge, that there's this long statistical tail of things that we know that don't happen very, very often, but just there's so much of it that the machines will encounter it even if it's not in their training data. So common sense knowledge is one limitation. No one knows how to give that knowledge to AI or have them learn it. A second one is abstraction. Machines are today, as Nisar and other people have mentioned, they're trained on huge amounts of data that mostly have been labeled by humans, for instance, in object recognition and so on. And they're very good on the kinds of things that they've been trained on. But once they've learned something, often they have a hard time abstracting that knowledge so that they can apply it in domains on which they have not been trained, on data that's different from the data that they've learned in their training sets. So this is in machine learning, it's called the transfer learning problem, whether machines can transfer what they've learned to new areas. So in humans, we just call that learning. That's what we mean by learning. When we learn something, we assume we can transfer it to other domains, at least to some extent. But in machine learning, that's like another entire problem called transfer learning, which has not been solved yet. And being able to do that kind of abstraction is one of the biggest challenges that machine learning has now. And the third limitation is, I think this was touched upon by Roland, is the explainability problem. When we train machines with huge amounts of data, and they can do very well in certain domains, it's very difficult to figure out why they're making the decisions they make and what they actually learned. It's hard to look under the hood of these very large neural networks that people are using and figure out what they learned. And sometimes what they learned is not what we intended to teach them. And there's a lot of examples where you can you can actually do some experiments and find out that the machine has actually learned, I think what Nisar called a shortcut, that is a concept that, or some kind of statistical correlation that allows them to do well on the task, but they haven't actually learned the concept that we're trying to teach them. Like if we're trying to teach them to recognize dogs, that they've actually learned to associate certain kinds of statistical patterns with dogs in the data set, but they haven't learned the concept of dog in the way that we humans understand it. And sometimes they can't explain what they've learned, so we assume they've learned what we thought we were teaching them, and we're sorely disappointed or alarmed when they make errors that we didn't expect. So I'll stop there and let other people chime in.
Great. So I really, just to quickly reflect back some of the limitations you talked about, I think it's really important to understand the common sense limitation and real world knowledge limitation. And you talk about this in your book. Like, to give one example that's been talked about is self-driving cars. You talked about they will jam on their brakes for obstacles, such like if a plastic bag blows across the road. Humans know that you can drive right into, a plastic shopping bag and keep driving, but a car doesn't know that a plastic bag is light and might jam on its brakes. So that's a good example. Common sense knowledge. And you also mentioned, Google Translate is pretty good, but it's also limited because it doesn't really understand the underlying concepts. It doesn't, if it's translating the word post office into another language, it doesn't know what a post office is, doesn't need to know. It just needs to have some patterns from corpuses of translated data that indicate that's the most likely translation or phrase without actually knowing. So there's this limitation on abstraction, abstract knowledge, and comprehension about the real world. Let me throw this out to the rest of the panel. What are some real limitations on AI? And Nisar, I see your hand there.
Thanks, Melanie. That was pretty comprehensive. I would say, building on the common sense thing, one thing that we humans can do, some of us who are competency aware, right? We're aware of our own limitations, and so kind of building back on some of what Melanie was saying, this idea that putting AI in a situation it wasn't trained for, or it's not designed for, that can be very subtle. And so with all these sorts of abstractions of data that are out there, it can be sometimes difficult to tell where that boundary is, and what went into the training or what went into the programming and what the programmer's intent was. So this idea of an intelligent agent, that can ask itself questions and say, am I really supposed to be doing this? Should I be doing this? That kind of a thing, sort of putting the brakes on itself, is also something that we don't think about even as we're designing these AI systems. So there's even a bit of a limitation just from the start that, these things are designed to do a certain thing, and sometimes they get used in the wrong way. They might be abused or misused, or unintentionally or intentionally, right? And it may even just be the design of the system was not complete, or it wasn't fully thought through for some reason. So that can expose some of these limitations that Melanie was talking about.
Great, yeah, so that's a really good point, Nisar. That is, and that builds on Melanie's point that a lot of AI today is sometimes what they call narrow AI specifically designed to solve specific problems, but what it learns in that context doesn't necessarily transfer to other contexts. So, a machine learning system learns how to play chess, won't necessarily automatically know how to play poker. Needs to be trained all over again. And then your idea of taking it out of its narrow context, sometimes it exposes the brittleness and the limitations. Claire, I saw you had your hand up.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on points from Melanie and Roland, really important limitations around both interpretability, and also it sounded like Roland was referring to issues about bias and fairness and transparency of the learned models. And so first, for the good news, there's massive research efforts in the field of machine learning specifically on these issues. So interpretability in AI, interpretability in machine learning is a bleeding edge area that doesn't really have answers yet, but people are working on it. And similarly, there's a community called FAT or FATE ML, which stands for Fairness, Accountability, Transparency, and sometimes there's the E on it for ethics. I'll speak just briefly to interpretability, and this is huge because, I work with climate scientists or things where we're trying to predict the track of a hurricane 24 hours in advance and alert a community. You need interpretable models. And for all the success of deep learning, the models learned deep neural networks aren't de facto interpretable, although there has been some progress on how to interpret them. But there are other branches of AI, such as Bayesian networks, probabilistic graphical models, where every possible variable that you care about is indicated in a graph, and you can see, you can reason about causal dependencies. The field of causality has really had a renaissance within AI because people care about interpretability. But yeah, these issues of fairness, bias, how do you get beyond the bias in your training data, and also interpretability are really our frontier right now.
Okay, great. Yeah, just to summarize for the audience what I've heard from Melanie, Nisar, and Claire, one of the major issues is a lot of AI systems, particularly machine learning and deep learning systems, are kind of black boxes where you feed stuff into them and they often will produce good results, but you can't easily tell why they're producing the results that they have. And sometimes they're actually producing good results for weird or strange reasons that turn out to be brittle, that break really quickly, or sort of weird artifacts in the data. So we don't really know about why it's producing it. By contrast, though, just to make the point, is that there are other techniques, as Claire said, that are actually more interpretable, where you can look at it and inspect it and figure out what's going on. And there's some value to being able to understand what's going on. And sometimes there's a trade-off between how well it performs and how well you can understand what it's doing. Let me throw it out to Roland. I saw you had a question, had a comment there about some of the limitations that you're seeing.
Yeah, so just on the first limitation that Melanie mentioned, the common sense reasoning, we've been sort of toying with the idea of calling a bar exam challenge, where we invite the legal AI community to create an AI that can pass the bar exam. And I asked my sort of inner circle of AI experts on whether they think it's realistic, what they think, how long that would take. And I got a full spectrum of responses from some people who are sort of deep in NLP and convinced that you can, with a sort of concerted effort of 3 months of research, you can create a natural language processing system that can actually pass. We sort of asked first about the contracts portion of the bar exam. They said, yeah, with 3 months of research on NLP, you can pass the bar exam. And then on the other side of the spectrum, there are people that are saying, no, you can't, because there's so much in those typical fact patterns that are asked on the bar exam. And there's so much common sense and common knowledge information that needs to be processed that's not really legal information, that we don't have, computers don't have a representation for. You would almost need a representation of the entire world. What's a cup, and what's, all these things. And so it's interesting to see sort of the broad spectrum of beliefs that the experts in AI have on what's the state of the art. And so and then for the legal also, I think one of the forefronts really is, you can do a lot of impressive things with natural language processing, extracting information from legal documents, for example, contracts, but understanding really the arguments in it, that's what we call legal argument retrieval. That's also, I think, that's also an unsolved problem still. And then part of the problem is that I think much of legal reasoning and decision making is not really based on what we taught, at least early on in law school, that it's like, okay, there's the law and you apply the law to the facts and you come out with a decision. But much of the legal decision making is based on analogy, and that's very hard for computers to do. I mean, there's a whole field of reasoning by analogy in legal AI. But I think that goes a little bit to the second point that Melanie mentioned, the problem that computers have with abstraction, and taking it sort of from one narrow narrow use case to the next, which is a lot how legal reasoning and legal decision making works. That's what I think that's still very hard for many AI systems.
Great. Melanie, I saw that you had a follow-up.
Yeah, I like this bar exam challenge idea, but it's interesting in AI. We've seen a lot of examples where AI systems have been trained to pass a particular test, like an IQ test, or we saw like with IBM Watson playing Jeopardy and so on, and they do as well or better than humans. But so I think maybe if an AI, a natural language processing system was trained on, millions of previous bar exam questions and answers, maybe it could do reasonably well. But the problem is it wouldn't be able to transfer its skills to anything that that exam is trying to test for. And that's what we've seen with like the IQ test, that these systems can pass an IQ test, but they can't do any of the tasks that you would expect that a human would be able to do if the human passed that same IQ test. So that's the issue with sort of this transfer learning. And I think that's a really important thing for people to keep in mind when they see results about AI systems like Jeopardy. We saw with IBM Watson, it was able to beat humans at Jeopardy, but it wasn't able to transfer that kind of question answering skill to any other domain in the same way. So I'll stop there.
I think that's a great point. I mean, one of the questions would be, once we have an AI that can actually pass the bar or certain parts of the bar exam, then the next question is sort of a policy question. Is like, how accurate a test, or how well does this test perform in actually turning people into the kinds of lawyers that we want to see in the market. But that's a separate issue.
Nisar, did you have a comment there?
I was just gonna build on what Melanie was just saying. Yeah, exactly. The transfer problem still kind of exists, and I wonder maybe what other people think, the other panelists, and maybe even you, Harry. Like, what are the prospects for getting beyond that issue? It seems like a fundamental limitation of computing that you have to represent these things, and the computer has to be told what exactly to do. So how can you get beyond that problem, of representing things not as data or as numbers, because that's kind of the source of the limitation, right? Is that you've got to give it something concrete to do, and it's got to do that, pass that bar exam. So here's all the data you need to pass this bar exam. So how do we, how does is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I don't know. It seems like that's inherent to the equation of using AI, right?
Yeah, so I think right now I have this little phrase that I use with my students when I teach this is intelligent results without intelligence. And that's kind of what maybe Melanie and you were getting at, where we find these sort of statistical proxies or patterns that can often produce useful results in the right context, but without the sort of deep, abstract background knowledge of what the subjects and concepts are being talked about, and that becomes very brittle. So I agree with this idea that maybe to make that next breakthrough, AI needs to understand more about the world, and in some way we need ways of giving AI knowledge about the world, but I don't see any promising research in that area, in my view.
But Harry, it raises an interesting question too, in a sense of like, in what context is that all we need, right? Do we really need the computer to have the knowledge, or do we only need the results? It's
Right.
It's like some courts have just as an example of the Brazilian Supreme Court has a backlog of 100 million cases or something like that, and some of those people who are parties in those cases will never, it will be decades before the court will hear their cases, and they've deployed a machine learning system that tries to adjudicate those or accelerate the adjudication of those cases, and it has those shortcomings that you don't quite understand, and the parties don't get a hearing, and all the things that you want to see as from a legal point of view, but maybe for the parties just want some kind of result and they don't care so much about the process. Anyways.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think one of the ideas is sometimes good enough is good enough. So I think Google Translate, for a huge number of problems, Google Translate is good enough. And even if Google Translate doesn't understand what's going on, but you wouldn't want Google Translate to be used for something extremely important, like, you know, a merger contract for two large corporations in the United States and France. Claire, I saw that you had a
Yeah, so this reminded me of a few things. First, Roland, you're probably already aware of it, but there's this Allen Institute for AI funded by Paul Allen, and they're just trying to get AI to do like a middle school standardized test. So, and last I heard that was still hard. So it'd be interesting, you know, how that translates to being able to do a bar exam. And also, I believe there's a project in Australia trying to codify law. This is not really using AI, but into computer code that can be machine checkable. So when new legislation is proposed, you can basically check, does it compile with all previous other regs, et cetera. So that's an interesting project. There's I think Data 61 is one of the agencies involved.
Yeah, that's a cool project.
Melanie, I saw that you had a comment there.
Yeah, so the Allen Institute for AI middle school challenge, so they actually have gotten machines that can pass middle school science tests, multiple choice ones. And it's a similar issue they have, though, with the problem is that these, even though these systems can pass these tests, they can't really use this knowledge to do the kinds of thinking that a middle school kid can do. So the tests, passing the test itself isn't necessarily an indication that the system is like at that level that a human would be at. And here's an interesting thing. The DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which funds a lot of AI, has now this, what they call machine common sense, kind of a grand challenge, where they're doing research on the process to build a machine that has the common sense of an 18-month-old baby. So it's very ironic, you know, that we can maybe get a machine that can pass the bar exam, but or you know, play Go, beat any human, but it's still a challenge to have the common sense of an 18-month-old infant.
Great. So thank you for that. Those are all really interesting answers. So I think we've heard a lot of limitations in abstraction and common sense and explainability. Well, since we are based out of a law school, let's turn the next question to AI as applied to law. And let me toss that to Roland, because you've addressed this a little bit, but you're one of the world's experts in legal tech, technology and AI applied to the practice or use of law. So where do we see AI actually making inroads in law or legal practice? And can you give examples? And also importantly, we see a lot of exaggeration by companies about artificial intelligence and robotic lawyers. So can you talk a little bit about where things are being exaggerated and we don't really have what's being sold to us?
Sure. Thanks, Harry. AI in the law is not a new field by any means. It's existed for decades. Even some of the earliest work back to the late 1950s, you know, thought about sort of legal use cases of AI. First industrial applications were the first search systems that were developed in the 1970s, and expert systems, late 70s, early 80s. But I would say maybe, you know, we see like a lot of new ideas and technologies coming to the legal system, and I would sort of organize it in 5 different buckets. So one is technologies that are used to search legal information, to search legal documents. Then big data law. That's something that started taking off like, I would say maybe 10 years to 12 years ago, with use cases for technology-assisted review. I mean, that's even older, e-discovery and due diligence. Then for compliance and also for quantitative legal prediction in litigation and in transactions. I already mentioned the contract analytics use case before. So this is a really hot area, this whole field of big data law. big data analytics in legal settings. Then computational law, but that we understand the automation and mechanization of legal analysis. So think about TurboTax is a classic example of that, but also computer computing contracts. I would say chatbots might fall into that domain. Then the fourth bucket is practice management. So there's lots of new technologies for legal professionals in running their business, and I would also say maybe these kind of legal marketplaces where AI is used to make the perfect match between the right lawyer and the right client. That would fall into that category. And then online dispute resolution. That's one area where technologies in a broader sense, but AI technology specifically have a more important role. You're right in that I would say a good 5 years ago, there was a lot of excitement around this concept of the robo-lawyer as the AI replacing the human lawyer. And there's been talk about all these startups. There's a ton of new startups, that were arguably building robo-lawyers, and a lot of fear in the profession in terms of what that means for legal practice, how legal practice, what's it going to do to legal practice? Are we going to see massive layoffs and lawyers losing their jobs? We have to. What does it mean for law schools teaching lawyers? And that that was, I think there was a lot of hype in that. I think there's much less talk today about the robo-lawyer than a few years ago. There were surveys done that that sent out every year by this consult. I think the Altman-Weil survey that actually asks managing partners of law firms with over 50 lawyers in the U.S. Whether they think commoditization of legal services is a permanent trend, and most of the lawyers think yes, that is a permanent trend. At the moment, they're somewhat less worried about that than a few years ago, and I think that's always a sort of a first step towards automation. But I think when I look at most of the technologies that I see coming up, and of course there's been a lot of sort of bottom of the market innovation, so LegalZoom and Rocket Lawyer of the world that help us kind of handle certain simple legal processes with technologies. And, it might be, in some cases, might be AI technologies. In other cases, it's just workflows. But I think on the sort of the higher end of the legal services market, I think most of the technologies that I see being produced are, lawyer enhancing technologies rather than lawyer replacing technologies. And an example from 2 years ago, which is kind of funny, there's this Israeli-US startup called Law Geeks. They ran a channel. They ran a contest between their algorithm, their issue spotting algorithm for contracts against 20 lawyers. And to no surprise, it's really focused just on non-disclosure agreements, but to no surprise, their algorithm was outperforming the lawyers. Their accuracy level was over 90%, and it did much better than the lawyers. And everybody was like, "Wow, what does it mean for lawyers?" And interesting, when they interviewed the lawyers who participated in the challenge, they were like, "Wow, that's great. So now technology can handle all these kind of low-level tasks, and I can focus on what's actually interesting, the higher level kind of legal thinking and strategy." And so I think I think AI technologies will not replace human lawyers. I think as you know, as long as they're humans, we'll have human disputes and human transactions that will have a level of complexity that will need human judgment, human common sense, human abstraction capabilities, context awareness. But I do think that these AI technologies will be used more and more. They will replace certain tasks, like data processing tasks, that lawyers currently handle and charge for. But I feel like the smart lawyers will start figuring out ways how to build systems that have enough knowledge in them to handle those tasks and handle them at lower costs for more people. And they will still sort of have that domain that requires sort of human legal judgment. But yeah, I feel like it's been a little bit, so we went through this kind of, we're going through this kind of hype, cycle, and we're now sort of, it's been somewhat de-hyped. I think AI will play a more important role in the profession. We see law firms now starting their own technology companies that are trying to figure out ways how to allow people to manage certain legal processes autonomously through systems that are intelligent enough to escalate a question to a human lawyer when necessary. And yeah, I think there will be some. That's maybe for your second panel today. There is some displacement of traditional legal work, but there's also, I think there's a question on will we have new kind of legal work, or the new legal careers almost for people to combine legal context knowledge, legal knowledge with automation of certain tasks. The law is an ever-changing field too. I think that's also going to be the role of the human lawyer, to make sure that the systems they put in place accurately reflect the law and have a current representation of the law in them. And yeah, maybe I should stop there before I miss. Yeah. Anyways, I think mostly in summary, I would say most of these technologies are lawyer enhancing technologies. They are exciting opportunities to they are getting more sophisticated, and we see examples of that. Some of these companies, they start with very low level applications, but they get more sophisticated. I think it's, most lawyers see the writing on the wall that they cannot do business as before. They have to embrace technology, but I think it also creates new opportunities for lawyers.
Great, thank you, Roland. That was a very comprehensive overview. I think one, reflecting back a little bit on what you said is, lawyers do a mix of tasks, some of which require higher order analytical skills and judgment and expertise, but some of which are more mechanical. And one thing I like to say to my students is, where today lawyers are acting like computers, doing mechanical tasks, tomorrow they will be replaced by computers. So a good example of that is document review. So you've talked about that. That's one of the biggest areas where we've seen inroads of AI. And for those who don't know, when there's a lawsuit and litigation, you often have to look through thousands or millions of different documents like emails to find those documents that are relevant to the case and distinguish those that are irrelevant. And some documents might be privileged, meaning between the client and the attorney, and other documents might not be privileged. And not that long ago, recent law school graduates spent a lot of their times at law firms in a windowless room, manually looking through tens of thousands of emails, marking them relevant or non-relevant or privileged or non-privileged. And then they figured out that for a lot of these tasks, you could apply machine learning. And what the machine learning was good at was not telling you what was relevant or privileged, but what was likely irrelevant. So it would find an email that was, very much outside the time frame of where the incident happened and would say that's likely excludable. But it couldn't tell you whether this was relevant to the law or relevant to the privilege. So that's a really interesting example of the capabilities of AI. So machine learning is able to go in and spot a bunch of patterns and exclude a lot of stuff. But for the emails or the documents that require higher order legal analysis and legal judgment to decide whether an email is relevant to the law and the facts at hand, the machine learning is not good at that, and we hand it off to the lawyers to make that sort of judgment, which I think is pretty fascinating. Does anyone else want to weigh in on AI and the law? Yes, Melanie.
So this is more of a question. So in a lot of domains, what we're seeing is that not only are we trying to make AI systems better approach human behavior, but we're also trying to make the infrastructure, the world, easier to parse or easier to analyze AI systems. So it's like we're changing our world to help computers as we're making computers help us with the world. So one example is for self-driving cars. There's a lot of discussion about how we need the infrastructure, how we need to put in more sensors and perhaps even change driving laws to help self-driving cars be able to deal with real world. And I'm just wondering if there's any analogy with that in law, if there's any sort of change way that documents are being created, thing that's being influenced by the fact that you're trying to get AI systems to help lawyers.
Oh, definitely. That's a great observation. So Roland mentioned computable contracts and computational law. So computable contracts is the idea of typical legal contract is written by lawyers in legalese, which is an unintelligible variant of English, written by lawyers. So one way around that is to create contracts basically in computer code that computers can understand. So you're deliberately expressing the contract as rules and data. So you're building the contract specifically for the computer to understand. We see this a lot in finance and the blockchain and Bitcoin. Also, we see this in legislation where there are ideas that legislation should be specifically written in a form that the computer can understand in structured, controlled language rather than ordinary natural language that humans talk in. And there's some consequences of that we can talk about at a later time. That's a great observation. That is happening in law. Roland, do you have any other examples or thoughts about that?
I think those are great examples. I know that my colleague Margaret Hagan, who thinks a lot about design thinking in the legal space, she has a project going on where she's actually trying to work with the search engines to make legal information more easily accessible to non-lawyers or Main Street America. But that's in sort of trying to use technology to make legal processes accessible to people with no legal training. They have to, when they have to go to the court or they deal with a landlord-tenant dispute. I don't think there's any specific AI examples there yet. Mostly it's just about using kind of workflows and the internet to do that. I think one thing we're seeing actually interestingly is that there's some technologies that have been deployed in an enterprise setting first. It's sort of let's say legal prediction for IP disputes. There's a company that came out of my center called Lex Machina. They allow people, the users, to predict or to get data-driven insights on how judges will respond to certain motions, that sort of thing. And this approach, I think, is now coming to other areas where maybe less money is at stake. I think it's sort of coming down to other areas of the law where we eventually even will see that in your local landlord-tenant dispute. I think that people will be able to use systems like that to make predictions about how a judge or another decision maker will decide.
Great. Oh, Claire.
So you framed it as AI and the law, and I think we heard a lot about AI for law, but a cutting edge area is law for AI.
Yeah.
And we've seen some legislation against killing robots, so drones, but there's a lot of gray areas that need to be filled in around self-driving cars, fairness in terms of data sets that are used. We're seeing this when we wonder whether tech companies are going to get regulated for detecting and flagging fake news, when that's a hard AI problem. So I wanted to put that in the mix.
Yeah, so and that from a law school's point of view, that's almost a more natural way to look at this, sort of more interesting questions to analyze is sort of what is the law and policy around this new technology, right? Like from all the issues you mentioned to of AI creation. That's something that certainly there's a lot of legal scholars thinking about that. At Stanford and other places. My center is more focused on sort of AI for the law and making the legal system, using it to make the legal system more efficient for all stakeholders, as we say. But those are critical.
Yeah.
I mean, those are all critical questions that are not just like the subject of scholarship anymore, but there's legislation being passed. Explainability, like the Europeans with their the data protection directive, they put in place a right to explainability, so people now can technically have a right to understand how an automated decision-making system came to a specific decision, and that raises a whole host of other questions on how to enforce that, how do you enable that access. So there's a myriad of interesting questions, legal and policy questions that AI has generated. Also, very interesting questions around what about the ownership interest in the data that are used to train machine learning algorithms, the input data and the output data. So it's a really interesting forefront, also just from the law of AI perspective.
Great. So thank you, Roland. So we got 3 minutes left, and I want to end on an optimistic note. So we talked a lot about job loss. Given what we know about AI, can anyone think of new types of jobs that might be created that we haven't yet thought about in AI? So economists call this complements. So can anyone, Melanie?
There's huge number of examples that already exist. so we have there's people who label training data for AI systems. There's whole companies that are devoted to that task. Another example that maybe doesn't, I'm not sure if it exists yet, but it will soon, is people who for like self-driving cars or self-driving delivery trucks or something. These systems can deal with maybe 90% of the situations on the road, but if they run into the 10% that they can't deal with, there's this idea to have sort of teleoperation, people like a drone, somebody who's driving a drone, somebody in, maybe thousands of miles away, but who's able to operate the vehicle, a human who's able to operate the vehicle to get it out of its problem situation. So those are just two examples of the many, many different kinds of jobs that have been created for AI systems. And I'm sure other people can come up with other examples.
Great. Nisar.
Oh, yeah, just building on that, in aerospace, this is an age-old problem. Ever since the airplane was invented, you have a machine wrapped around a person, and the person has to figure out how to fly this thing in this weird way. And again, I bring back the airline pilot example. Some people want to just take pilots out of the cockpit and turn them into these managers, these teleoperation people on the ground. and you would have these unmanned aircraft just flying all over the sky with just one person, you know, debugging all of these different systems. I think maybe realistically, instead of new jobs, it will definitely transform existing jobs into ones where really it's more collaborative. And, you know, that maybe is a bit of a different mindset, is that maybe these algorithms have to kind of be aware of where a human would be useful. So the self-driving car example, this idea of handing off to the driver, you know, like we see all these crashes with Tesla or whatever, you know, these other car companies, and usually the human's at fault, but it's because the control reverts back to the human just a few seconds before, you know, something bad happens, but that's not enough time for someone to react and be aware what's going on. So I think there could be sort of an interplay between these things as well, where maybe you'll see some algorithms kind of march towards opening the doors for people to kind of come in and help, and people might have to be trained to react differently to the problems that they're used to, as Melanie was saying. So they're not in control of these low-level things anymore, but there really are more supervisors or more managers for things that they already know how to do. So that's one probably near-term thing for a lot of applications.
Great. Anyone else want to weigh in the last minute quickly? Claire or Roland? Roland?
No, Claire, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh.
No, I was just going to say there's the e-discovery attorney. That's a new kind of role that was kind of created in the legal space. And some firms are hiring now data scientists for law firms. But you know, I think there will be many new roles, and maybe might be, you know, some might be just kind of new specializations of existing roles.
Well, we're out of time, but I want to thank my terrific panelists. You guys were excellent, and I think you did a terrific job of explaining these very complex ideas to the audience. I'm really grateful you were able to join us. We're going to take a break now from 10:20 Mountain Time to 10:35 Mountain Time and return to panel 2, which will focus on the economic and policy response of AI automation. So thank you so much.